Stop reaching for expensive chemical creams that only mask the symptoms of your swollen ankles. Modern medicine often overlooks the most potent remedies sitting right in your pantry. We are reviving a forgotten Amish generational ritual using raw apple cider vinegar to draw out stubborn fluid and stimulate deep circulation naturally. By 6 in the evening, millions of people across the country are doing the same thing without realizing it. They sit down, they look at their feet, and they sigh. Their ankles are puffy. Their shoes feel tighter than they did at breakfast. Their socks have left a ring around their calves like a tide mark on a beach. This is not rare anymore. This is not something that happens only to the elderly or the unlucky. This is the quiet, daily reality for an enormous number of people living modern lives, and most of them have no idea why it is happening or what their grandparents would have done about it. Here is the uncomfortable truth about 2026. We sit more than any generation before us. We sit in cars, we sit at desks, we sit on couches, scrolling through the very platform you are watching this on. Our diets are loaded with sodium, hidden in foods that do not even taste salty. Processed meals, convenient snacks, restaurant dishes built for shelf life and flavor rather than nourishment. The combination of stillness and sodium is a perfect storm for fluid retention. Blood and lymph move slower when muscles are not contracting to push them along. Salt pulls water into the tissue and holds it there. The result shows up exactly where gravity sends it first, the feet and the ankles. Doctors have a clinical name for this swelling, edema. But you do not need the clinical name to recognize the feeling. You know it by the way your wedding ring suddenly feels tight, by the indentation your sock leaves in your skin long after you have taken it off, by the strange heaviness that settles into your calves around the same time every single evening. What used to be an occasional inconvenience for people who stood on their feet all day at physically demanding jobs has quietly become a near universal complaint, cutting across age groups, professions, and lifestyles that look nothing alike on paper. Part of the shift is simple math. The average adult today spends a staggering number of waking hours seated, whether commuting, working, or unwinding in front of a screen. Compare that to a farming household 200 years ago, where movement was woven into nearly every task, from hauling water to walking fields to standing at a stove for hours preparing meals from scratch. Stillness used to be rare and treasured. Now it is the default state of an entire civilization, and our circulatory systems, which evolved to expect almost constant low-level movement, are struggling to keep up. The other half of the equation is what we put into our bodies. Sodium hides in places people rarely think to look. Canned soups, deli meats, frozen dinners, even bread and cereal. The body responds to excess sodium by holding on to water to dilute it, and that retained water has to go somewhere. Gravity decides where, and gravity always chooses the lowest point available, which for someone standing or sitting upright is almost always the feet and ankles. It is a quietly notable irony that the conveniences designed to save us time, prepackaged meals, fast food, grab-and-go snacks, are often the very things accelerating the swelling we then spend money trying to treat. Walk into any pharmacy and you will find an entire aisle dedicated to this problem. Creams promising instant relief, compression socks in every color, anti-inflammatory gels with long chemical names on the label. Some of these products genuinely help in the moment, but many people who use them notice something frustrating. The swelling fades for an hour, maybe two, and then it creeps back. That is because most of these products work on the surface. They cool the skin. They create a sensation of tightness. They distract the nervous system from discomfort. They do not necessarily change what is happening underneath, in the tissue itself, where fluid has pooled and circulation has slowed. This is where a much older approach comes back into the conversation, one that has nothing to do with a laboratory and everything to do with generations of people who did not have access to pharmacies at all. Amish and Mennonite communities have long histories of treating everyday ailments with what was on hand: vinegar, herbs, salts, and time-tested rituals passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor. Long before modern transportation made a pharmacy a 10-minute drive away, these communities relied on what grew in the garden and what sat in the cellar. Raw apple cider vinegar was a staple in nearly every farmhouse kitchen, used for preserving food, cleaning, and treating minor ailments. The vinegar soak for tired, swollen feet was one of those quiet household rituals, not written down in any medical text, just passed along the way a recipe is passed along, by watching your mother do it and then doing it yourself when your turn came. The idea behind the soak is simple. Warm water opens the pores and relaxes tight muscles. Apple cider vinegar, with its mild acidity, is believed by those who practice this ritual to help draw fluid through the skin's surface layer and encourage the kind of gentle stimulation that gets sluggish circulation moving again. Add a handful of Epsom salt, which has its own long history in folk remedies for sore muscles and tired limbs, and you have a soak that generations of farm families turn to after long days of standing, walking, and working fields that did not care how tired your legs were. Why did this ritual survive for so long in these communities specifically? Because Amish and Mennonite life has always been built around physical labor. Farming, raising children, tending animals, walking long distances rather than driving. Swollen, aching feet were a daily occupational hazard long before edema was a word anyone used. The soak was not a luxury spa treatment. It was maintenance, the same way you would grease a wagon wheel or sharpen a plow blade. Your body was a tool for the work of the day, and you took care of it so it could keep working tomorrow. Consider what a single day actually looked like in one of these households. Rising before sunrise to milk cows and feed livestock. Hours in the field behind a horse-drawn plow, the body absorbing every jolt and uneven furrow through the legs and feet. A midday meal eaten standing or briefly seated before returning to work that would not pause for comfort. An evening spent on chores that had nothing to do with the field, hauling water, splitting wood, mending fences. By the time the sun went down, the feet had absorbed more impact and strain than most modern people experience in an entire week. There was no question of whether the feet would ache. The only question was what you did about it once the work was finally finished. This is also why the remedy traveled so easily from household to household without ever being written into a formal text. It did not need to be written down because it was demonstrated, repeated, and absorbed the way most domestic knowledge was absorbed in these communities, through doing rather than reading. A daughter would watch her mother prepare the basin after supper and understand, without being told directly, that this was simply part of what you did to keep going. By the time she had her own household, the steps were second nature. This oral, hands-on transmission of practical knowledge is itself one of the defining features of Amish and Mennonite culture, a preference for lived tradition over written instruction, and it is part of why so many of these small household remedies survived for generations, while more official medical practices of the same era have long since been abandoned or disproven. There is something almost startling about how closely this mirrors our modern problem, even though the cause looks completely different on the surface. The Amish farmer stood in a field for 12 hours. The modern office worker sits in a chair for 9. Both end the day with the same swollen ankles, the same heavy feeling in the calves, the same instinct to put their feet up and breathe out. The body does not care whether the stillness comes from standing rigid behind a plow or sitting rigid behind a keyboard. Swelling is the body's way of saying that movement has not matched the demands placed on it, one way or another. So how would this ritual actually look if you brought it into your routine today? The traditional approach is straightforward enough that it required no special equipment, which was the entire point. A basin large enough to comfortably fit both feet. Warm water, not scalding, just warm enough to feel soothing against tired skin. A generous pour of raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, the kind with the cloudy strands of mother still visible in the bottle, believed in folk tradition to carry more of the vinegar's natural properties than the clear, filtered versions sold for cooking convenience. A cup or two of Epsom salt stirred in until it dissolves. Feet in the basin for 15 to 20 minutes, often in the evening after the day's work was done, sometimes while sitting and mending clothes or shelling peas, because farm life rarely allowed for a task that was only one thing at a time. For someone today who spends all day on their feet, whether you are a nurse, a teacher, a retail worker, or anyone whose job keeps you upright for hours at a stretch, this is not meant to be an occasional treat. It works best as a rhythm, something you return to several evenings a week, rather than reaching for only when the swelling becomes uncomfortable enough to notice. Many people who have revived this practice describe doing it 4 to 5 evenings a week, treating it the way you might treat brushing your teeth, a small maintenance ritual, rather than an emergency intervention. Timing matters too, in a way that mirrors the original practice almost exactly. The soak works best at the end of the day, after the swelling has already accumulated, rather than in the morning before the day's standing and sitting has even begun. This is the same logic the farming households followed, without ever articulating it in those terms. You do not maintain a tool before the work. You maintain it after, so it is ready again tomorrow. Some people find it helpful to pair the soak with the last hour before bed, treating it as both a physical reset and a signal to the body that the working day has officially ended, a small transition ritual in a culture that often struggles to mark any clear boundary between work and rest at all. There is room for small variations depending on what is available. Some households added a few drops of lavender or peppermint oil to the basin, less for any specific physiological effect, and more because the scent itself became part of the evening sense of relief, a sensory cue that the hard part of the day was over. Others simply used what they had: vinegar from the cellar, salt from the kitchen, water warmed on the stove. The remedy was never about precision. It was about consistency, about returning to the same simple action night after night until it became as automatic as locking the door before bed. There is a second piece of ancestral wisdom that pairs naturally with the soak, and it costs nothing at all: elevation. After the basin is emptied and the feet are dried, lying back with the legs propped above heart level for 10 or 15 minutes lets gravity do the opposite of what it does all day. Instead of pulling fluid down into the ankles, it helps fluid drain back up toward the body's circulatory system, where it can be processed and moved along properly. Farm households did this too, though they would not have called it elevation. They called it resting with your feet up on the porch rail, or lying on a quilt with your legs against the wall after supper. The vocabulary has changed. The physics have not. There is also a quieter lesson buried inside this ritual that has nothing to do with vinegar at all. It is about attention. The Amish soak was never a 5-minute task squeezed between other obligations. It was a deliberate pause, 15 or 20 minutes of sitting still, often in conversation with a spouse or in quiet reflection at the end of a demanding day. In a culture that has largely lost the habit of unhurried pauses, the ritual itself, the act of sitting down, tending to your own body without rushing, may carry as much value as anything dissolved in the water. None of this means the vinegar soak is a substitute for medical care, and it is worth being honest about that. Persistent or worsening swelling in the legs and ankles can sometimes be a sign of something more serious. Things like circulation problems, kidney function issues, or side effects from certain medications. If swelling comes on suddenly, affects only one leg, or comes with pain, redness, or shortness of breath, that is a conversation for a doctor, not a basin of warm water. The Amish themselves were not opposed to medical care when it was genuinely needed. This ritual existed in the much more common, everyday category of ordinary tiredness and ordinary swelling after ordinary hard work, not as treatment for underlying illness. Used in that everyday context, many people simply find a few minutes of warmth, vinegar, and stillness brings comfort and a sense of relief at the end of a long day. The same comfort their great-grandparents found generations ago. What makes this story worth telling is not really about feet at all. It is about a pattern that keeps repeating throughout Amish and Mennonite history and through most pre-industrial communities in general. When you cannot drive to a store and buy a solution, you learn to look closely at what is already around you. You learn that vinegar is not just for salad dressing, that salt is not just for seasoning, that 15 quiet minutes at the end of the day is not wasted time, but maintenance for the only body you are ever going to get. That kind of resourcefulness was not born from idealism. It was born from necessity, and necessity tends to produce wisdom that survives long after the original necessity has faded. We live in a world of conveniences. These communities deliberately chose not to adopt, and there is an honest irony in that. Our conveniences gave us cars, elevators, and desk jobs, which gave us sedentary lifestyles, which gave us swollen ankles, the very thing their old-fashioned, labor-filled lives also produced, but for entirely different reasons. Two completely different paths arriving at the same destination. Swollen feet at the end of the day, and an old solution from one of those paths quietly waiting to help the other. There is something almost poetic in that convergence. The Amish farmer suffered swollen feet from too much physical demand on the body. The modern office worker suffers swollen feet from too little. Opposite causes, identical symptom, and one ritual quietly bridging both worlds without either side needing to fully understand the other's circumstances. It is a reminder that the human body has not changed nearly as much as our lifestyles have. The feet at the end of a long day in 1850 and the feet at the end of a long day in 2026 are asking for the exact same thing: warmth, stillness, and a few minutes where gravity is finally working in their favor instead of against them. This is, in many ways, the real value of looking back at these communities at all. It is not nostalgia for a simpler time, and it is not a suggestion that modern medicine has nothing to offer. It is a recognition that some problems are old enough and human enough that the solutions did not need laboratories to be discovered. They needed attention, patience, and a willingness to notice what worked and repeat it generation after generation until it became tradition rather than experiment. That is precisely what separates a fad from a ritual that survives 2 centuries. The fad disappears the moment something newer and shinier replaces it, while the ritual survives because it never stopped quietly doing its job. If you decide to try this tonight, Here is the simple version. Warm water in a basin, a cup of raw apple cider vinegar, a cup or two of Epsom salt, 15 to 20 minutes, feet submerged, a few evenings a week if your days keep you on your feet. Dry off, then lie back with your legs elevated for another 10 minutes. Notice how your feet feel afterward compared to how they felt when you sat down. That is the whole ritual. No clinic visit, no chemical compound with a name you cannot pronounce, no subscription, no app reminding you to do it. Just warm water, vinegar, salt, and the same 15 minutes of stillness that kept generations of tired, hard-working people moving the next morning. The next time your ankles ache after a long day, you will have a choice. You can reach for the tube of cream that masks the feeling for an hour, or you can sit down, fill a basin, and borrow a small piece of wisdom that has outlasted the people who first practiced it. Some traditions fade because they stop being useful. This one is still here because it never stopped working for the people who needed it, and there is a good chance it still works for you.